Good afternoon and welcome to the session Telecommunications Infrastructure, Disinformation and Cyber Personhood. This session brings together perspectives of all CyCon tracks by combining legal, technical and strategic views. I'm happy to present to you our speakers. We have Kim Hartmann, Cyber and Information Technology Director at the Conflict Studies Research Center in the United Kingdoms. Hi, Kim.
Hi.
It's nice to have you here. Then we have Professor James Shires, Assistant Professor at the Institute for Security and Global Affairs at the University of Leiden. Welcome, James.
Good.
And Neil Kushwaha, who is, among many other things, founder and advisor at Impendo Incorporated. Hi, Neil.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are.
True, pardon me. Good point. You got me.
So, we will now hear each of our speakers present their papers and ideas, and we will ask one or two questions after each presentation. And as a reminder to our audience, whether you are at home, in the office, or however you are joining us today, you can submit your questions by using the chat box icon in the right corner of your stream. I'll be receiving your questions and I will do my best to address them to our speakers, so please ask away. After the presentations, we will have some time for a discussion and for audience questions. So if I can't address your questions immediately after the presentations, I'll do my best to do so in the last segment of this session. Now, let's start with our first presentation by Kim Hartmann. Kim, you wrote a paper for CyCon titled Adversary Targeting of Civilian Telecommunications Infrastructure, explaining our dependency on communications infrastructure and how these can be targeted, disrupted, and attacked. Kim, please, the stage is yours.
Hello. So thank you for having me here. I'm very excited. It's a great honor to be at CyCon again this year. I haven't been visiting CyCon and speaking at CyCon for a couple of years, but it's always great to see all the faces again, even if it's just virtual. So I know one of the big difficulties with CyCon is always to decide on which stage should I actually attend, because there are so many interesting talks going on at the same time. So what I want to do is to kind of help you on the decision as a start. So if you feel that you are part of a government, an organization, or an agency that is to a large extent relying on private telecommunication infrastructures, then I believe that you really should stay, because you will need to be prepared for a new type of attacks, which are going to be direct against the physical infrastructure of these services. The same applies if you are part of an enterprise that provides IT services or products to a customer base that is either big enough, crucial to uphold civilian lives and structure, or part of governmental services or utilized by those. Because in that case, you are always also going to be experiencing a new type of physical attacks that we have not been considering that much in the past. So in the paper, you will find a series of events that have happened over the past couple of 24, 48 months, where we have seen that our infrastructure is indeed a danger. But the question that I'm going to address right now is actually what is new and why are we seeing these types of events coming up now, and why should we need to prepare for them directly? So what is new about this whole type of events, or why they are actually coming to rise recently, is that the aim of our adversaries is now to control our information space. And we have seen that there are many of ways to do so by cyber attacks. We have seen disinformation campaigns in the past. And what we are seeing now is that our infrastructure is also vulnerable to physical attacks in terms of destruction, manipulation, and rerouting. As I said, the aim of all of these is always to control the information space, the flow of information through interdiction, interference, and manipulation. There are details on why this is a type of political activity that has been seen in the past. It's in the paper. I will not go into the details, but if you would like to see them, you can read the paper. Apart from that, what I'm going to focus on is the technical background to all of these. So why are we seeing these type of events coming up more recently now, and why are they that important to us? So what has happened over the past couple of months, as we are all aware, is that we have had a growing dependency on telecommunication, even more than we've had in the past already. What has also happened is about 20 years from now on, we have started to put many things away from the physical entity. So when we think about data or information, we do no longer think of the machine that is hosting the data. We are thinking of it being somewhere in the cloud or at a vendor, and that it will always be available when we need it. This has actually made us vulnerable because we do not consider the physical security of the devices that are holding that data or that are controlling our communication flows. There's also another thing that really stroked my mind, is that back when I went to university, which has been a couple of years now, we were talking so much about including redundancy in our networks, in our software, in everything that we did as computer scientists. By now, redundancy is not such a big topic anymore in the syllabus of many curricula. At the same time, it has been considered a security vulnerability in the past, which has often been misunderstood because people were thinking that IT security experts were saying that you should get rid of redundancy. What they were actually trying to say is that you should get rid of bad redundancy. Now, unfortunately, I could go on talking about redundancy for a very long time, which I don't have the time to do right now, but it's something that we really need to focus on, again, in order to avoid being attacked physically. So what we also have seen, or some of the examples we have seen in the past, to just give you some ideas of the events that have happened, which gave the input to this paper. Of course, one of the first ones was the AT&T bomb detonation in Nashville, Tennessee on Christmas Day 2020, which actually led to a complete communication breakdown from Georgia to Kentucky, including the 911 call centers and hospitals. Mm-hmm. We have also seen the OVH data center in Strasbourg, France, burning down in March 2021, which had a tremendous effect of 3.6 million websites being temporarily unavailable. Some of them actually were governmental portals. So while these two have been accidents or incidents that have not been considered as being attacks, they show us something very important, namely the vulnerability of our infrastructure to such types of interferences with them. It is a way of interfering with cyberspace that we generally do not consider any longer because it's considered physical security. And physical security is something that cybersecurity experts do not consider as much as they should. There's also been a couple of other attacks on the other domains. So in the paper, we have divided the events that we have seen into land, air, sea or subsea, and space activities. Some of them actually being true activities, others being incidents. So the messages that I'm trying to get across with this paper, or that we are trying to get across with this paper, is first of all to remind you all that cyber is not abstract. Everything that you put in cyber is a real physical machine or a communication link at some specific location. We are also going to see a rise in the number of physical attacks against digital assets. This is something that is often underrepresented and neglected during the planning, which is why our physical systems are now being attacked instead of just our cyber systems. And the third thing that I would like to get across is that we need to prepare for these types of attacks. We need to install, especially as governmental agencies, we need to install fail-safe communication links to uphold during cyber conflicts in order to be able to communicate with our civilians. The same, of course, applies to vendors. You need to prepare for these types of attacks against your physical properties in order to uphold your services even during times of conflict. So if you feel that you can answer any of these questions with yes, then you will be at risk. So if you walk through your server farm and you hear someone saying, so this is the heart of our project, often with a proud intonation to it, then that is a risk. If you feel that, or if you hear someone saying the data will be provided by the system, or, well, the communication is going to be handled by the system, or even another common heard phrase, this server or service will always be online except when being maintained, then you have to be aware that these may be risks, because these are sentences pointing to single points of failure in your infrastructure, and you need to handle those. So thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Kim.
I've got some good notes.
Thank you very much, Kim. Yes, you brought forth some very interesting points and very interesting presentation in general. I can see that we did not yet receive any listener questions, but I'm sure we will receive some until the discussion. But in the meantime, I have a question to you. It's concerning the paper. So in the additional measures to improve resilience, you describe preparations and practices by Western governments and armed forces to operate in an environment where communication services are unavailable, and you talk about regular exercises of alternative means for distributing public information. So how could such exercises look like in practice?
So in practice, basically what we are saying with that statement is that we need to get back to a way of communicating that is not utterly dependent on telecommunications to work, first of all. So looking back prior to the whole cyber area, we have been able to communicate before that. Excuse me. And so we need to learn ways of communicating. We also need to establish ways of communicating that are not dependent on external services.
Mm-hmm. And the sort of public information you are talking about here, is this government to citizens, or rather government bodies to government bodies in case of a crisis?
Actually, both. So actually both. Because obviously, if you need to uphold communication between government to government, then that is going to be affected during a crisis. So you will need to train and establish ways to communicate from government to government, the same as government to citizen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you, Kim, for your presentations and your replies. And now we will move on to the second presentation by James Shires. James, you wrote a paper with the beautiful title, Windmills of the Mind, Higher Order Forms of Disinformation in Internal Politics, discussing the separation of first-order forms of disinformation from higher-order forms of disinformation. I'm looking forward to hear more about this. Please, James, the stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Philip, for hosting this session, and thanks also to the CyCon organizers for putting together such a wonderful program. I'm really honored to be part of this excellent panel, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the other presentations. Thanks also to the audience, and please do submit questions whenever you can. So in my paper, I'll talk a little bit about this, not too much detail, just to give you a quick overview, and then we can get into the discussion later on. As Philip said, it's titled Windmills of the Mind. We can ignore that bit. It's mainly focused on what I term higher orders of disinformation. For those for whom that is a bit abstract, essentially it's disinformation about disinformation. This is an increasingly prevalent problem in international politics, and it's something that I think we need to pay more attention to. I do so in the paper by sketching out a real schism in approaches to thinking about disinformation. Most states and many other organizations, big social media companies, have all recognized the dangers of disinformation in international politics. Especially in pandemic times, there are risks that the online public sphere could easily be swayed or corrupted due to the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation, the former being unintentional and the latter being deliberate. But although many different states and organizations have recognized this importance, there are two very different ways to tackle this problem out there at the moment. One focuses very much on fact-checking, on trying to ensure that the quality of the information in the public sphere is as good as possible. More specifically, it tries to remove information that they feel is disinformation. It's deliberately fake, false, or misleading. And we see this especially in terms of pandemic news and news around vaccinations and so on. Now, this is a very micro form of intervention, right, because it tries to tackle disinformation on the level of the specific claim itself, saying this claim is false, please remove this claim, whether you're doing that as a state regulator or you're doing it as a responsible content moderator, or even you're doing that as an NGO, right, a voluntary fact-checking organization that is trying to improve the quality of debate in the public sphere. That's one broad approach to tackling disinformation in international politics. Now, the other one isn't micro at all. It goes much more macro. And it says, well, it's not too important whether this information is true or false. What's more important is the idea of influence. And this really focuses on the deliberate kinds of false and misleading information. So this is disinformation rather than misinformation. And this approach says, well, what we need to look at are especially state-backed and state-directed influence campaigns, deliberate, targeted efforts to shape public debate towards certain areas or away from others to the advantage of the actor behind that campaign. And this approach to disinformation has a long history, right? The idea of propaganda, of influence campaigns, of what Thomas Rid calls active measures, goes far beyond the current online information environment. It's a technique of statecraft and international politics that has been used for decades, if not centuries. So we have these two really different ideas about how to view the problem of disinformation. One micro, focusing on fact-checking, trying to disprove specific claims. The other one saying we need to look at influence campaigns, not on specific claims, but maybe on networks of what Facebook calls coordinated inauthentic behavior. Right? These are actors moving together, trying to shape the debate, trying to influence audiences in certain ways. What I want to say is maybe we can connect these two different approaches by thinking about disinformation, by thinking about the connections between different contested and disputed claims that are out there in international fora. And this is because both aren't quite satisfactory as a solution, right? If you look at the micro level, then the problem is that as soon as you try and get into disproving fact-checking claims, especially ones that are highly politically charged, ones that have a lot of controversy around them, that inevitably brings you into contesting narratives, right? The idea that actually each claim, small facts, are part of broader narratives, and they can't be judged as true or false, except in their wider context. And so even when you see a lot of EU efforts to try and do fact-checking at a very individual level, they often get drawn into these broader narrative contests. And those narrative contests are exactly what the idea of influence campaigns tries to address, right? It tries to look at these state-directed or often with commercial intermediaries in between ideas trying to shape the international debate. But that also is unsatisfactory. Right, because it doesn't address the reason everyone's looking at disinformation overall is that people feel it is significantly different to broader forms of influence in the media more generally. Right? There is no non-biased, completely neutral media out there, so some of it is worse than others, and one of the reasons we think that is worse is because it is false or especially misleading. Right? So this idea of influence campaigns doesn't quite capture the heart of the problem, the reason why we're all motivated to solve it in the first place. And what I say is, well, maybe we can connect this micro and this macro view from specific facts to broader narrative context by thinking about the way in which different disinformation claims and disinformation operations connect to each other. Mm-hmm. More specifically, I say that we can think about how they're reflective, right? How they refer back to one another. So this can happen in two ways. One is that they can build on one another. So one of the case studies I look at in the paper is disinformation around the classic case of the US presidential elections in 2016. Here I show how you have different claims stacking on top of each other, one intelligence assessment leading to another intelligence assessment, leading to a public dossier, leading to a claim by a particular government official, all referencing back to each other. Now, for those who see these as disinformation, this is growing and it's moving from a specific false claim that you can fact check towards what becomes an overall narrative, right? A network or a stack of claims that all fit together in a neat story. But you can also see higher orders of disinformation, or these connections between forms of disinformation in terms of contesting as well. And this is something we increasingly see in the policy domain at the moment. You see accusation of a disinformation campaign, especially towards a state, being responded to by saying, well, that accusation itself is disinformation. Right? This occurs in terms of Saudi Arabia and the Khashoggi report that was published by the US quite recently. It occurs in terms of the UK and the BBC's investigation into human rights abuses and mistreatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China and the Chinese response to that investigation. Here you have disinformation claims referencing back to previous disinformation claims and even back to previous ones and so on, all the way down. Right? And here they are still building on top of each other, but in a contested rather than a connected way, right? Rather than stacking on top of each other. What I say is that this is a really important problem to deal with in international politics because we have to think about it both defensively in terms of connecting narrative kinds of defense against and with fact-checking kinds of defense, but also, as you increasingly see with many states, they're considering offensive responses to disinformation, trying to do counter-disinformation campaigns, and the risk is that those will get caught up in these broader narratives. So we have both defensive and offensive policy implications, and I recommend you check out the paper for more detail. Thanks very much, Philip. Back to you.
Thank you very much, James. And when you explain it like this, it doesn't sound as complicated. So I'm very happy that we have a audience question, and I will read it to you. How emerging and disruptive technologies, EDTs, are being used as part of these disinformation, misinformation campaigns? How EDTs can be better leveraged to address those campaigns through the use of AI? So I think this is a technology question.
It's a good one as well. So thanks very much for the question. The short answer is that emerging technologies are very closely connected with forms of disinformation and influence campaigns. The idea is that the actor behind a deliberate influence campaign wants to make it as efficient and as effective as possible. Mm-hmm. Right? So they will do as much as they can to achieve those goals. Now, efficiency and effectiveness are both provided by online social media platforms. They enable, for example, micro-targeting at specific audience segments. They make things much cheaper. You don't have to invest a lot of time and resources in terms of generating the content themselves. Mm-hmm. These are all emerging technologies. And one of the ways that we see this developing in the future is definitely in terms of automation. Right? Trying to use natural language processing to generate content itself, make that even more efficient, even more cost effective, but also to maybe try and alter disinformation claims depending on their responses from particular audience segments. So again, to try and get the targeting automated as well. Now, it's a big open question about whether you can develop forms of AI or algorithm-based detection against disinformation that are effective, that are reliable, and there's a lot of research and investment going into that area right now. So that's a big open question. It's definitely something worth pursuing, and we can see that happening more in the future.
Thank you very much. I'll immediately address our second audience question. Is there any hope of using public debate to throw light on the competing narratives in a useful way?
Definitely. So I think they are these competing narratives stand and fall very much in the public debate. Right? The idea of influence campaigns is that they are out there influencing the public. This means that we can study them, right, because they are out there. But it also means that when you're looking at the public debate, you have to really take it into account where it's happening. So the tendency of a lot of researchers is to say, well, maybe the public debate is a debate on Twitter, right? Or it's a debate on Facebook. This is a very platform-based occurrence, sort of approach to thinking about where the debate is. Actually, what I would really encourage is cross-platform approaches, right? Looking at where debates are happening simultaneously across platforms, but also where they shift, right? And we see this a lot with more proactive platform responses to influence campaigns in the last couple of years, where you have debates going from maybe more public forums, more public platforms, to more private channels as well. So I agree that public debate is the core of the problem, but actually getting into how public that debate is, where it really happens, really gets us into the heart of the current trends in disinformation operations.
Thank you very much, James. I see that now we are receiving a couple more questions, but we have to move on. We will try to address them during the discussion later on. We will now move on to the last presentation of this session by Neil Kushwaha. Neil's intriguing paper with the title Cyber Personhood lays out the concept of legal personhood and how and why it could be applied to cyberspace. Neil, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Phil. I must first take a moment to recognize our co-authors for their contribution to this paper. Thank you very much to Keir, Tassilo, and Bruce. And to my co-panelists, Kim, James, I really enjoyed your papers and thrilled to have a seat next to you on this session. I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank the CyCon CCDCOE team, the peer reviewers, the audiovisual team, and many more for their hardworking efforts making this experience from yesterday into the next few days a complete success. I'm in Ottawa, and while we're still under relatively strict lockdown measures, I haven't had a haircut in about 6 months, and this 1980s hair that I'm stuck with is forever on record in this video. So I hope it brings a smile on your face. I'm missing Tallinn and the enthusiasm among the delegates, the icebreaker, the conference dinners, the mixers, and the general hospitality. I hope we can reconvene in person soon. So all that, I'm going to take a bit of a different approach for this talk. I realize that the term cyber personhood is unique and can easily result in a conflicting discussion at the legal, policy, and technology levels. My work covers all of these areas, so to help explain the concept, I'm going to bring you back to where I was when I thought of it. Early June 2017, I was on my way back from CyCon's Defending the Core, and terms like cyber attack and cyber as a domain of warfare were ringing in my head. And I walked away thinking about their definitions, lexicon, taxonomy, with a legal perspective. Then back in Canada on the 10th of October, I was listening to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, our CBC radio program, where an interviewer named Anne-Marie Tremonti was interviewing David Boyd, an environmental lawyer. They were discussing his new book at least, called The Rights of Nature. And listening to the interview jumbled more thoughts into my mind, and I began to think, what if someday in the future, really complex cyber systems are also granted cyber personhood rights? Then if we were to be attacked, we could legitimately call them cyber attacks. Well, that radio program was the germination of this paper. I jotted some notes down under the term cyber and biomimicry. And between then and now, this paper has come out. So from 2017, I need you to think very far forward to help explain this thought. And avoid applying this concept to anything I'm about to share, to anything that you're able to touch today. So think very far into the future. Think of a very highly interdependent cyber system. In the near future, imagine things like fully autonomous vehicles without steering wheels, interconnected with each other from varying manufacturers, and systems that are critically dependent on time signals, not only waking you up in the morning, but also maintaining your digital identity and encryption for connecting you to common services in cyberspace. Think of the blurred roles and responsibilities of such a system. And think even further into the future and consider how societies may rely on cyber systems based on emergent phenomena and complexity theory systems, or physical systems managed entirely by AI. Now consider several of such future systems being highly interdependent on each other. They are consuming and feeding each other's data and have deeply nested computing. Parts are run by governments, while some parts are run by corporations, with very blurred lines of responsibility. What you hopefully have in your mind right now is what we refer to as a highly interdependent cyber system. Not widely accepted, some states such as Bangladesh, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, India, and New Zealand have enacted laws to support environmental personhood. Leading the charge was Ecuador in 2008, but it all started 36 years before that with Chris Stone's 1972 legal paper, Should Trees Have Standing? Stone's paper referred back to a time when rights for corporations, women, and others were unthinkable. He described that today, children and inmates have limited rights. He went on to describe environmental rights, their liabilities. It was a very interesting paper, and indeed controversial back in 1972. Without getting into the details, in a very few minutes of an introduction for our paper, we had similar thoughts as Stone, that someday in the future, some states may adopt the legal position of cyber personhood, but only for a highly interdependent cyber system. Our paper describes scenarios where it would not apply at all, and scenarios where it would most likely apply. We also discuss some policy and legal matters to help understand how states may, one, handle injuries impacting the system along with injuries caused by the system. Two, states may claim cyber attack outside of armed conflict, impacting the state in conflict, along with states not in conflict but reliant on the highly interdependent cyber system. We also discuss how states may manage cyber attack under armed conflict. Furthermore, we get into obligations, liabilities, representation, and guardianship. We believe one of the values of the paper is to pre-think the concept of cyber personhood in a future where systems are so interdependent that their loss of service would impact our daily life, our state's economic stability, possibly international agreements, and more. We believe the concept of cyber personhood deserves discussion, especially since tools to govern it are already available. For us, the questions remain, which cyber systems will develop the criticality and complexity deemed worthy of being governed under international law, and which countries are bold enough to make this concept a reality under their respective domestic laws. Thank you very much. And once again, I'd like to thank the CCDCOE team and the entire team of this CyCon event for this opportunity. Phil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Neil. We appreciate it. And we appreciate having all three of you here. You are, so to say, veterans of CyCon. So, Neil, one thing that I was wondering about cyber personhood is, would giving personhood to a cyber system remove the responsibility from creators and operators of systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's something we debated as well. The concept of the responsibility, if you can tie that responsibility back to a company or an organization, government that may be even, or an alliance, it's probably not a great candidate for this concept of cyber personhood. And I think the challenge is when they're very, very tightly coupled. And our idea of that, and maybe a reasonable explanation of that, we see software systems and hardware coupled systems, software systems being written and developed in very quick turnaround, possibly one would say poorly written. And then they intertwine with other systems, data feed from here, data feed from there, and back and forth feeding each other. And when that starts to happen, it's really difficult to ascertain exactly what went wrong and how it went wrong. And it can take a lot of time as just bringing it back online. And that we face some of that today. I'm looking extremely forward in an environment where we can't really pick on this company being responsible or that government being responsible. And so those scenarios where that interdependency is extremely high is where cyber personhood may apply. So your question relating to, is it, could we not pin a company on it? Could we not pin the responsibility of a service provider on it? Could we not pin the government on this thing? Could they not be responsible? I would urge anybody thinking that way to kind of relieve themselves from that and think even further forward and a very coupled systems. Mm-hmm. Yeah, hopefully that answers the thought there, Phil.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think I see that we received a lot of questions actually, and I think that many questions will be also concerning cyber personhood, which is a very polarizing topic, I guess. So I suggest we move on to the discussion part now. So we can address a few audience questions and maybe also questions from the panel itself. So raise your hand if you want to say something. I'll start with the first question that I received here for Kim, and it's a very long one. Part of the problem with addressing the nexus of cyber and physical vulnerability is mutually exclusive mandates by different security entities. How should this challenge be best overcome to address vulnerabilities that lie at the nexus of interdependency, of cyber and physical risks? How should organizations, commercial or state, best organize these challenges? It was a very long one, Kim. I hope you could get the essence of it.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. It's a long one, it's a complex one, but it's also a good one, so thank you very much. So basically the question is, as I get it, asking what can we do to actually handle the vulnerabilities that we experience, especially being very intertwined or having very intertwined systems nowadays. What I believe, one of the things that I tried to address during the talk, although just done very briefly, is that we need to, one, find other means of communication that we can rely on in case of crisis, of emergencies. And two, with this communication that we have already, we need to establish valuable, good redundancy, and we need to maintain this redundancy. So also adding on to the question you asked, Phil, after the talk, what we can do is to not just have redundancy in our telecommunication systems, but also we need to test it. We need to make sure that it is working. When talking about in technical terms about redundancy, it's not just having another system somewhere in the place that you can just boot when you need it, but you also have to make sure that it's up and running, it's up to date, it's not being vulnerable itself. It is well interconnected with the existing system, and that it actually works when the main system goes down, that you relaunched your redundancy system. So there are many things to do. I could go on talking about this question for the next 10 or 15 minutes. I don't want to do it, but it's a good question, and it's a long topic that needs addressing. So basically, what you should do is to get your security manager to actually get to think about these kind of questions. How can I install redundancy in technical means and ensure that it is being maintained and that it's actually working in the case of an emergency? And you need to train, of course, your personnel also to work with that situation in that case then.
Thank you very much, Kim. Anybody else from the panel wants to reply as well? Or should I move on to the next one? All right. So I'll read the next question. Are there many recent examples of disinformation campaigns leading to a physical attack on critical telecoms infrastructure? So burning of 5G masts, for example. I guess this is a question that combines James and Kim's topic a little bit.
Yeah, I can start off with that. That works. I think the best one is the one that the question's already identified, right? This idea of 5G being targeted because of misinformation around its connection to the pandemic. Now, the question there is really, how far is this a misinformation or a disinformation campaign? Is this something like a conspiracy theory where it's emerging almost without deliberate strategic intervention, or is there something more sort of strategic there, some kind of intent there that makes it an influence campaign? My reading of the current debates is a lot of this is more towards the misinformation side. So you have these people acting based on things that they've read online, but they're not sort of being directed to do so in a very sort of, especially not in a state kind of way. But maybe there's stuff out there that prove me wrong. In terms of other forms of critical communications infrastructure, I'd love to hear Kim's thoughts on which ones might be most at risk from actors motivated maybe by malicious disinformation.
Please, Kim.
Okay, it's a very interesting question. Well, I think that basically almost anything could be a target. The question is, of course, and that's more your topic, James, what type of disinformation can actually lead to get people into doing physical harm to an entity. So that is kind of the question, taking it from that side, so explicitly asking, has there been a disinformation campaign that has led to physical damage of, for example, telecommunication infrastructure or other infrastructure? One thing that I could think of directly would, for example, be to install distrust in governments. E-governance systems would be one thing. I'm sure there's been many thoughts on this, especially in Estonia, because I know you are one of the biggest e-governance systems users in Europe, at least. So if you were to install distrust among your citizens into that system, that would actually have quite tremendous effects. First of all, it would, of course, lead to the civilians not using the system anymore, but it may also cause to more harmful effects in terms of actually trying to get the system down. If you were to install, for example, a rumor that your government were to sell personal data to foreign governments or whatever, if you were to install that type of distrust, I can imagine that there would be an outrageous mass of people who would try to stop the government from doing that, and in those terms then could actually do or cause physical harm to the entity.
Neil, would you like to add something?
Well, that's a really difficult topic to discuss. We face that in discussions as well, and how do you disassociate between this conspiracy theory versus the campaign itself is one part of that discussion that was touched upon. And then the discussion of impact to CNI. I mean, on the physical side, can we turn those? Can one turn those information, disinformation, misinformation, or even conspiracy theories into physical result? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the biggest discussions on our entire cyber sort of term of attack over the last few years. Can that become kinetic? And it's a great discussion topic. So I'll leave that up to those who've done the study there.
All right. Thank you very much. So let's move on to the next audience question. And I'm very happy to report that we have a lot of audience questions. And please keep them coming. This is really nice. So what are the factors that influence how powerful a certain narrative is? And what structures, whether state or otherwise, have been most successful at generating these comparative advantages? James, I think this is a question for you.
That one's for me as well?
Yes.
Yeah. Clearly, there's lots of different factors that really affect how powerful a certain narrative can be, and these apply to both online and offline narratives, right? So now we're talking much more about sort of, this is media in general. One is its sort of propagation by key figures, by a certain influential, they might be elites, you think about celebrities or politicians or particular people that occupy a lot of space in the public consciousness, right? So any kind of promotion there is really powerful in just getting the narrative out there. Now, this is why we have the concept of influencers on social media. The idea there, the name influence is not without reason. The idea is that they are particular people who are able to influence large numbers of others. But focusing on particular individuals or even particular organizations is only one half of the story. And the danger there is it's too much of a supply side idea of disinformation rather than a demand side idea of disinformation as well. So what we also need to think about are factors that make a particular narrative very powerful is because it fills a hole in people's understanding, right? It helps people explain a bit of the world that they don't have a good answer to for whatever reason. The world makes sense to them, right? And that's very much the demand side kind of story it comes from. And we have to think about both sides here. So this is both the spread by particular individuals or campaigns, but also the context in which it lands. Does it resonate with existing popular narratives? Does it use tropes or ideas that are already out there, that it brings them together, that it reshapes them in a coherent format? So, there's lots of different factors, but I could separate them broadly into both supply and demand side, and I'd say we have to think about both.
Thank you very much. I think we have sort of a follow-up question. Do you think AI and machine learning can be used to automate the aggregation of multiple weight sources to increase trust of the source? So I guess the person asking the question is asking how we can use machine learning and AI to enhance trust in sources as opposed to watchdogs organizations or journalists, or maybe combine it.
So I mean, we could go back to original, attempts to enhance credibility in sources in intelligence agencies, right? And now we're switching from media studies to intelligence history. Mm-hmm. We can think about, well, let's do source ratings in terms of, are they reliable and are they credible in the specific kinds of information they're delivering, right? These are very mechanical ways. They work quantitative models. And clearly in intelligence analysis and assessment, there's been far more resource devoted to thinking about how to judge the credibility and reliability of information. Now, the question was talking about, can we automate this? Can we use AI or algorithmic ways of weighting far more ideas about whether a source is trustworthy or not? The main question or sort of big problem I think that would have to tackle is actually in terms of data labeling in the first place, right? In order to have some kind of algorithmic training that does this, you'd have to provide it with a data set that was reliably weighted, that you had attachments to various credibilities, that was a sort of archetype data set. Now, that for me is something that probably doesn't exist, right? Because of exactly what I was talking about in the paper in terms of connecting specific claims back to broader narratives, right? So I don't know if we can get that useful ground truth in algorithmic senses in terms of labeling claims as trustworthy or not. What is maybe a more useful way of thinking about it is looking at reaction, right? Looking at how people treat particular claims and see what they do in terms of their reaction to it. Do they share it? Do they like it? Do they pass it with their friends? Do they comment? Can you do sentiment analysis on the kinds of things they comment? So maybe you can automate that kind of detection mechanism through reactions rather than through trying to judge credibility of the content itself.
That makes sense. And I was also thinking every system can be also used then for malicious purposes and to spread at that point misinformation as well. So instead of helping, it could be used the other way.
Yeah.
We have a question from Neil. ISPs struggle operationally and financially to be the regulators of its users, while it's not completely restricting the use of internet service. Where should carriers draw the line?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought too. So if we consider what carriers do, they offer a service and a very fixed service, very distinct terms, and very strict legal boundaries that we have in states as well as in at a state level, as well as at their contractual level between individuals and domestically, internationally as well as domestically. And I think that if that is well defined, I think we have a premise to carry upon that. We don't need to change that. I think the story behind what we are trying to describe is when it's really messy, the lines are really not clear, and they're very difficult to make clear. So Somebody brought this up earlier on in our discussion. Actually, part of the peer review process was why couldn't we just pin it on a company? Why couldn't we just say, hey, this company is responsible or that government's responsible for said service? And I think when I received that feedback, I was faulting myself for not being able to describe the scenario well enough. And the scenario well enough is that it's very difficult to ascertain who and where the responsibility may lie for such a system, and that we also are very dependent on it in a sense that, you know, we're dependent on internet, absolutely, and communication services, absolutely, cellular services and whatever not, and our mobile devices, and soon to be more and more dependent, I'm sure. And that's not what I mean by it. I mean that we don't function without it. You know, without a cell phone, yeah, I can function. Without an alarm clock, I'll still wake up in the morning. But if certain things were extremely dependent on certain services, such that they wouldn't even start in the day without those things, without those connections or services or alarms or whatever they might be, if you can think of, at that point, harming such a system could really impact your society and your economic capability within that region or the state. Could be interdependent among multiple governments across multiple borders. Systems sharing across the EU, for example. So that's kind of where I was leading that thought. When you think of the internet service providers, it doesn't. I'm thinking, yeah, I think those constructs are well defined and can continue to be used.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have another question concerning cyber personhood, and this is a very interesting one, and maybe I'm looking forward to hear your reply to this. Working on the presumption that a cyber personhood has to make decisions, how does a legal cyber personhood develop its own ethical point of view, especially in terms of law during armed conflict, collision avoidance in autonomous vehicles? Yeah,
we discussed that, and it's a really complicated thought, actually. So what I'm digesting is the person that's asking the question, and thank you for that question, is saying that you know, when a system becomes significantly autonomous, or if not completely autonomous, whereby it's essentially rewriting its own algorithms and that it was originally based upon, and performing actions based on its newly written algorithms or revised over time again and again algorithms. And when it's used in or out of conflict, how is that applicable? Our paper gets into certain examples of highly autonomous systems in these highly integrated systems and interdependent systems being discussed in this terms of when they're in law of armed conflict or in silent conflict situations. So, for example, states are in conflict and that system is critically dependent. We didn't really tackle it in terms of it's performing an action in conflict. We looked at it from a perspective that citizens use it of the state or residents of the state use it or states use it. And let's say that system is party to multiple states and one of those states goes into conflict. And what is the responsibility, and how does that apply among the parties that are using that system? We discussed it from that perspective, but the thought of that particular system being used in conflict, for conflict, to support conflict, was not part of our study. Sorry.
So that's
but a very interesting question indeed.
It is, and maybe it's a topic for a follow-up paper.
Yeah, yes, very good point. Thank you for that.
So we are receiving many questions, and thank you a lot to the audience for that. I'll address the next one. We have seen so many successful attacks on critical infrastructure now during peacetime that I have to ask myself, how can we achieve a good level of security in case of wartime? Is this even achievable? So I think, Kim, this is a question targeted towards you, but maybe Neil, you want to add something afterwards? James is welcome as well.
So yes, please, you're all welcome to jump in on that question, because I think it's a very interesting topic. Of course, yes, it's absolutely valid to ask if we are already experiencing so many attacks against critical infrastructure, which now going to back a little bit, we have to know that critical infrastructure is, in most European countries, infrastructure that is by some means additionally protected. So most countries are aware of their critical infrastructure being critical, as the word says. So they are trying to actually establish better security mechanisms within those infrastructures. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work out. So it's absolutely legitimate to ask, well, if this is already happening during peacetime, what will actually happen if we are in a real cyber conflict or at wartime? And the question whether it will actually be able, or we will be able to truly achieve some level of security that is allowing us to uphold our lives even during such a time. I would like to say yes. I still think we can reach a level of security where we can at least uphold our daily lives, and we can at least uphold the critical infrastructure to a level that allows us to go on, even during a conflict, but we are not there yet. And one way would, of course, be, again, redundancy. I feel a bit silly to actually reiterate redundancy all the time, because it's been such a very basic concept in computer science back in the days, in the 90s, and even to the early 2000s. But unfortunately, it seems to be something that has been lost. And but as I said, redundancy is not equal to redundancy. So redundancy that is put into the same building. If you have a server that is situated in the same building as the main server and you call that having redundancy, then no, you're not doing redundancy. You're not doing it in a good way. If you have a redundant system that you have somewhere in your basement and you never look at, you don't take care of, then that is not good redundancy either. So I think we need to do many things to actually establish that level of security, but I think it's something worth trying to get, because it is our critical infrastructure, and I think that we can do a lot better than we do nowadays.
Thank you very much, Kim. I saw some movement on James' chair. James, did you want to add something?
No, I think Kim's pretty much covered it. I think I would definitely emphasize redundancy. Done a lot of work myself on resilience and the question of how closely those two concepts are related. I would just say that this divide between protecting critical infrastructure in peacetime and in wartime maybe isn't as strong as you think, right? And that maybe the same things you should do in peacetime are the same things you should do in wartime. And actually what we're seeing now, especially in terms of the use of cyber operations, is that they are often used in this sort of gray zone in between the two, right? And sort of competitive state conflict that is below the threshold of war, but not really out-and-out peace as well. So, I would say there's probably more of a continuum, and so you're seeing the same techniques, the same philosophies and core concepts, such as redundancy, applying throughout these different contexts.
Neil.
I echo the comments made by Kim and James as well. If I think about the question itself and saying that is there a sort of a protection, or do we anticipate this being the same under conflict, or even worse under conflict? I think if we just consider certain things of critical infrastructure in itself, if it enjoys a very high standard of protection, and even if you consider if it's used exclusively for civilian purposes, it's also qualified as a civilian object, and therefore very highly protected under conflict. I think that the complexity would be, and this kind of ties back to the previous question as well, if I may, is that if, for example, a party to a particular CNI or any system is really abused by, or used and abused by another party for military purposes, then that civilian object can be potentially considered a military objective. And those kinds of things are really messy in terms of, as it's described, from a legal perspective versus when it actually plays out. I think those are, it's a legitimate question to ask, and I I don't have an answer. I'm curious to see how states respond to that. I think that's the best way to say it.
Thank you very much, Neil. I see that we are getting more and more questions, but sadly we are running out of time. We have 15 seconds left in this panel. But to everybody that's asking questions now, you can read the full papers of our presenters here today in the CyCon proceedings, so maybe you will find some answers there. And I'm sure that all of our speakers will be happy if you get in touch with them, if you have very burning questions. So we are now coming to the end of this session, and I would like to thank our speakers, Kim, James, and Neil, very much for their excellent presentations and the great discussion that we have. We were able to cover a lot of questions, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much to the three of you. And I would also like to thank our audience for watching from all over the world, tuning in and being part of CyCon this year. We will now have a 10-minute break, and then we will continue with a panel on the European Union's challenges and outlook for cybersecurity in the digital decade. Have a nice break, and see you at 5:20.